Midnight at the hospital brought a patient who was dying. All the doctors ran around in panic while the old security guard stood calmly. The young doctor shouted at him, "Get away from here." The man stepped back, but 10 minutes later, when it became clear, he was the only one who could save that patient. Welcome to Silent Legends. Before we begin this powerful story of hidden expertise and silent heroism, tell me in the comments from which city are you watching today. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, hit that subscribe button and help us honor those who serve in the shadows. St. Mary's Hospital never slept, but it had rhythms. Dr. Michael Torres knew them all after 3 years in emergency medicine. The controlled chaos of day shifts, the eerie quiet of late evenings, and the unpredictable storms that hit between midnight and dawn. What he didn't know was the man who had been watching those same rhythms for 15 years. Robert Silva appeared on no staff directory beyond security night shift. No last name in most systems, no employee photo, no emergency contact. He was a ghost in scrubs, moving through corridors with the kind of silence that made people forget he was there. At 67, Robert looked older than his years. Gray hair kept military short, deep lines around eyes that seemed to see everything and reveal nothing. He wore the standard security uniform, navy polo, black pants, radio clipped to his belt. But something about the way he carried himself, the way he checked corners and exits, suggested a background that went deeper than hospital security. The night shift nurses had long since stopped trying to make conversation. Robert would nod politely, give one-word answers, and return to his rounds. He covered the emergency department, surgical floors, and ICU with mechanical precision, same route every hour, same quiet efficiency. Dr. Torres had noticed him, of course. Hard not to when you worked the same hellish overnight shifts. But Robert was furniture to him, present but irrelevant. Just another aging security guard counting down to retirement. That perception lasted exactly until 12:47 a.m. on a Tuesday in October. The ambulance screamed into the bay carrying what the paramedics called a trauma one. Multiple gunshot wounds, massive blood loss, barely clinging to life. Maria Santos, 34, mother of 2, caught in crossfire during a convenience store robbery. Dr. Torres ran alongside the gurney as they wheeled her in, calling out vitals and barking orders. Blood pressure dropping, pulse erratic, breathing shallow. This was bad, really bad. "OR3 is ready," shouted Nurse Patterson, running beside them. "Get me 4 units of O-negative stat," Torres called out, "and page Dr. Richmond, we need trauma surgery now." As they burst through the emergency department doors, chaos erupted. Residents scrambled for equipment, nurses prepped IV lines, and somewhere in the background, alarms started blaring from other patients who needed attention too. That's when Dr. Torres noticed the old security guard standing by the nurse's station, watching with an expression that didn't match the situation. While everyone else moved with urgent panic, Robert stood perfectly still, eyes focused not on the patient, but on the growing pool of blood beneath the gurney. "Get away from here," Torres snapped, not breaking stride. "This is a restricted area." Robert stepped back without argument, hands behind his back, face unchanged. But he didn't leave. He simply moved to the corner where the hallway met the trauma bay, close enough to observe, but far enough to stay invisible. Dr. Torres forgot about him immediately. He had bigger problems. In OR3, Dr. Richmond's hands worked with practiced precision, but Maria Santos was dying faster than they could save her. The bullets had torn through her abdomen, nicking her liver and perforating her bowel. Blood loss was massive, and despite 2 units of transfusion, her pressure kept dropping. "She's going into shock," announced the anesthesiologist. "BP 80/40 and falling." Dr. Torres assisted, trying to control bleeding while Richmond worked at the primary repairs. But something was wrong. The bleeding wasn't stopping. Worse, it seemed to be getting heavier. "There," Richmond pointed with his scalpel, "arterial bleed. But I can't get a good angle." Torres could see it too, a tear in the hepatic artery hidden behind scar tissue from what looked like an old surgery. The position was awkward, the space too narrow for conventional repair techniques. "We need vascular surgery," Richmond said, sweat beading on his forehead. "Page Dr. Holbrook." "He's in Phoenix until Thursday," Patterson replied from the monitoring station. Richmond's face went pale. "Then page whoever's covering for him." 5 minutes later, the answer came back. "Dr. Chen is in surgery, Dr. Williams is in Miami at a conference. No vascular surgeons available until morning." Torres watched the monitors. Blood pressure 70/35, heart rate climbing. They were losing her. "We have to try," Richmond said, repositioning his instruments. "Even if the angle is wrong, we have to try." But 3 attempts failed. The artery was too damaged, the position too difficult, and every manipulation seemed to make the bleeding worse. At 1:23 a.m., Maria Santos flatlined. "Stop compressions," Dr. Richmond said quietly. "Time of death." "Wait." The voice came from the doorway. Quiet but carrying absolute authority. Every head in the OR turned to see Robert Silva standing at the threshold, no longer in his security uniform, but wearing surgical scrubs that seemed to fit him differently than they fit anyone else. "Excuse me?" Dr. Richmond's voice was sharp with exhaustion and grief. "You can't be in here." Robert stepped forward, his movements precise and confident. "That patient has a retroperitoneal hematoma compressing the IVC. The primary bleed isn't arterial, it's venous from a tear in the left renal vein. You're looking in the wrong place." The silence in the OR was deafening. Dr. Torres stared at the man he'd dismissed as irrelevant furniture. The voice was the same, but everything else had changed. Robert's posture, his expression, even the way he moved. It was like watching a different person emerge from inside the security guard's body. "Who the hell are you?" Richmond demanded. Robert was already at the sink, scrubbing with movements that were automatic, practiced. "Dr. Robert Silva, trauma surgery, Johns Hopkins, 1984 to 2019, 35 years. And that patient isn't dead yet." He turned from the sink, hands dripping, eyes locked on the monitors. "Restart compressions, 2 milligrams epi, push, and somebody give me some room." Dr. Richmond hesitated for exactly 3 seconds. Then he looked at the flatlined monitor, at the young woman who would never see her children again, and stepped aside. What happened next would be talked about in St. Mary's for years. Dr. Robert Silva, not the security guard, but the surgeon who had been hiding in plain sight, moved with a precision that made the previous attempts look clumsy. His hands found the bleed in 30 seconds, not where they'd been looking, but exactly where he'd said it would be. A venous tear, partially hidden by adhesions from an old appendectomy, bleeding slowly but steadily into the retroperitoneal space. "Satinsky clamp," he said calmly. Nurse Patterson handed it to him without hesitation. "How did you know?" Dr. Torres asked, mesmerized by the economy of movement, the confidence in every gesture. 35 years of looking at bleeding people," Robert replied, his hands never pausing. "You learn to read the signs, entry angle of the wounds, pooling pattern of the blood, pressure readings. They tell a story if you know how to listen." The repair took 18 minutes. Clean, precise, no wasted motion. When Robert stepped back, the bleeding had stopped completely. Maria Santos's blood pressure began to climb. "Jesus," Richmond whispered. "How did you—" But Robert was already removing his gloves, his face returning to the same neutral expression he'd worn as a security guard. "She'll need monitoring for the next 48 hours. Watch for signs of compartment syndrome and run a coag panel. She might need factor replacement." He walked toward the door, leaving a room full of stunned medical professionals in his wake. Dr. Torres caught up with Robert at the elevator. "Wait, what just happened in there?" Robert pressed the button for the main floor, his eyes focused on the closing doors. A patient lived who would have died. That's what happened. "That's not what I mean, and you know it." Torres stepped closer. "You're a surgeon, a really good surgeon. What are you doing working security at a hospital?" The elevator descended in silence for several floors. Then Robert spoke, his voice so quiet Torres had to strain to hear it. "I worked trauma surgery for 35 years, saved thousands of lives, lost some too. And somewhere along the way, I forgot why I became a doctor in the first place." The doors opened at the ground floor, but neither man moved to exit. "Hopkins offered me department head in 2018, Robert continued. "Politics, fundraising, committee meetings. I turned it down. They offered it again in 2019. When I turned it down the second time, they suggested I might be happier elsewhere." "So you came here?" "As a security guard?" Robert finally looked at him directly. "I came here to remember what healing looks like without the ego, without the recognition, without the politics, just helping people." Torres shook his head. "But you're wasting your skills. You could be saving lives every day." "Who says I'm not?" Robert pressed a button, and the elevator began ascending again. "Tonight, a mother of 2 goes home to her children. Tomorrow, maybe someone else gets lucky. Sometimes the most important work happens when nobody's watching." By morning, word had spread through the hospital with the speed that only hospital gossip could achieve. The security guard was actually a surgeon, not just any surgeon, doctor. Robert Silva, whose research on trauma protocols had been cited in medical textbooks, whose techniques had saved countless lives. Dr. Patricia Hawkins, the hospital administrator, arrived at 7 a.m. to find her office phone already ringing. "Is it true?" The voice on the other end belonged to Dr. James Mitchell, chief of surgery at Johns Hopkins. "Do you have Robert Silva working security at your hospital?" Hawkins pulled up the employment records on her screen. "We have a Robert Silva in security, yes, but—" "Patricia, that man is a legend. He pioneered half the trauma protocols we use today. If he's at your hospital, you need to get him back in the OR immediately." Similar calls came throughout the morning. Colleagues from Boston, colleagues from Chicago, residents who had trained under Silva and were now department heads themselves. Each call painted the same picture. Robert Silva wasn't just a good surgeon. He was one of the best trauma surgeons of his generation. At 3 p.m., Dr. Hawkins found Robert in the security office, filling out his daily report with the same methodical precision he'd shown in surgery. "Dr. Silva, could I speak with you privately?" Robert looked up, unsurprised. "I suppose this conversation was inevitable." In her office, Hawkins didn't waste time with small talk. "I've been getting calls all day. Apparently, you're something of a celebrity in surgical circles." "I was. Past tense. I'd like to offer you a position. Department of Surgery, attending physician. We could use someone with your experience." Robert was quiet for a long moment, looking out the window at the parking lot where he'd walked security rounds for 15 years. "I appreciate the offer," he said finally, "but I have a job already." "Checking ID badges and walking corridors? Dr. Silva, with respect, you're overqualified." "Am I?" Robert turned back to face her. "Last night a woman lived because I was in the right place at the right time. How many trauma surgeons can say they prevented a death just by being observant?" Hawkins leaned forward. You could prevent a lot more deaths working as a surgeon. Could I? Or would I be trapped in the same system that made me forget why I became a doctor in the first place? 3 days later, Dr. Torres found Robert on his usual rounds, checking the locks on the pharmacy doors. "I heard they offered you a position," Torres said. "And I heard you turned it down." Robert nodded. "Word travels fast." "Why? You could be making 10 times what you make now. You could be saving lives every day." Robert stopped walking and looked at the younger doctor. "How many patients do you lose this month?" The question caught Torres off guard. What does that have to do with anything? How many?" Robert's voice was patient but insistent. Three patients." "And how did you handle it?" Torres was quiet. He remembered those 3 deaths vividly. The elderly man who came in too late, the teenager in the car accident, the young mother with an undiagnosed heart condition. "It was hard," he admitted. "You never get used to it." Robert nodded. "In 35 years of surgery, I lost 847 patients. I remember every name. And for the last 10 years of my surgical career, I was so focused on my success rate, on my reputation, on proving I was still the best, that I forgot each of those numbers represented a human being." They walked in silence for a moment. "Working security," Robert continued, "I see this hospital differently. I see the night shift nurses who work double shifts because they care. I see the housekeeping staff who notice when a patient is scared. I see the small acts of kindness that happen when no one's keeping score." "But you could do so much more." Robert stopped at the end of the corridor, looking through the glass doors into the ICU where Maria Santos was recovering, surrounded by her family. "Could I? Or would I just be one more surgeon who's forgotten that the most important work we do isn't about us at all?" Months passed. Robert continued his security rounds, but something had changed. The story of the security guard, who was actually a legendary surgeon, had spread beyond the hospital walls. Medical students began requesting rotations at St. Mary's, hoping to catch a glimpse of the man who had walked away from fame to serve in silence. Dr. Torres found himself paying attention to details he'd never noticed before. The way Robert observed patients in the hallways, noting signs of distress that the medical staff missed. The gentle way he redirected lost family members. The fact that emergency response times had improved simply because Robert anticipated problems before they became crises. One night, during a particularly difficult shift, Torres watched Robert help an elderly man find his wife's room, speaking with a kindness that seemed to calm the man's obvious anxiety. "You know what I think?" Torres said later, catching up with Robert near the elevator. "I think you never stopped being a surgeon. You just changed what you operate on." Robert looked at him with something that might have been approval. "Explain." "A surgeon fixes what's broken, right? But it's not always about cutting. Sometimes it's about watching, noticing, being there when you're needed." Torres gestured around them. "This whole hospital runs a little smoother because you're here. Patients feel safer. Staff work better. You're not just providing security, you're healing the whole system." Robert was quiet for a moment. Then he smiled. The first real smile Torres had ever seen from him. "Maybe you're learning something after all, Doctor." Torres. 2 years later, when Dr. Torres was offered a position at a prestigious hospital in Los Angeles, he turned it down. When asked why, he couldn't quite explain it. Something about remembering why he'd become a doctor in the first place. Something about understanding that the most important work sometimes happened when nobody was watching. Robert Silva continued his night rounds, still invisible to most, still crucial to everything. Medical textbooks began including a footnote about the Silva protocol, not just surgical techniques, but approaches to observation, prevention, and holistic patient care. And sometimes, when the night shift was quiet and the hospital settled into its rhythms, young doctors would find themselves walking alongside the security guard, learning lessons that weren't taught in medical school. About service without recognition, about expertise without ego, about the difference between being important and being useful. Robert never sought credit for these informal teachings. He simply continued his rounds, watching over the hospital and everyone in it, proving every night that the greatest healers are often the ones who never ask to be seen. Because sometimes the most powerful medicine isn't what you prescribe. It's who you choose to be when nobody's watching. So now I ask you, have you ever met someone like Robert Silva? Someone whose true greatness was hidden behind an ordinary job? Someone who chose service over recognition? Share their story in the comments. Tell us about the hidden heroes in your life. Thank you for watching Silent Legends. If this story moved you, subscribe and help us honor those who serve in silence. Their stories deserve to be told, even if they'd never tell them themselves. And remember, the next time you see someone in a uniform, behind a counter, or cleaning a floor, look closer. You might be standing next to someone extraordinary who simply chooses to be ordinary every single day.